I think we have people running our housing department who aren't very capable. We spend our time tiptoeing. If I were the minister, I'd be saying, here's a 20% derelict levy, and next year it's 40%. And get on with it. The sheriff has arrived, and if you don't get off the street, you get a bullet.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 174 for the 7th of August, 2024. And we're back. Sorry about the unannounced little hiatus for the podcast. I'll tell you a bit more about it, but first, just to say I'm lining up a great roster of guests, interesting people to talk to, interesting things to talk about for the coming months. Kevin and myself will try to devote a bit of time to putting it all together. Obviously, we have day jobs, and I really appreciate Kevin's help. Thank you, Kevin. But the thought struck me that we could probably do better on social media. So if there's anyone out there who has the skills and wanted to volunteer to help on that front, or even just suggest a to-do list, we'd love to hear from you. And that's a bit of the reason for the hiatus. It was partly because I was busy with work and other things in life, but mostly I needed to take a break from all the awfulness in the news. I felt like not being a news junkie for a while. You could say that I needed a low information diet. I never wanted to deal with breaking news on the podcast, but forgive me if I'm not bang up to date on every issue. I was pretty thorough about avoiding all the news and social media apps and websites for the past while, and it seems like the algorithms have got the hint. I've been served up all sorts of strange stuff recently. But maybe that's just the world moving on.
Can you help me out with something, though? Because there's so many Irish names that are almost impossible for people who aren't from Ireland to pronounce. Help me out. These are real Irish names. Tell me how I'm supposed to say
that one's Saoirse.
That's Saoirse.
Does anyone know how to pronounce that in the audience?
How?
Tig.
Tig?
Yeah. Nave.
What?
Nave.
Nave?
Yeah. But it's Neve.
That's the Irish actor Saoirse Ronan being interviewed by Stephen Colbert, the Irish-American talk show host, a few years back.
Oisin.
Oisin.
Yeah. How do you think that's pronounced?
This one I know. Siobhan.
Yeah, Siobhan.
Siobhan. Ridiculous.
Yeah. A lot of people say Saoirse.
Ridiculous.
I'm using it as an example because I don't want to focus attention unfairly on anyone who's just a regular person on social media, but it's a good example of one of the things that has been served up to me online recently, which you could probably summarise as Irish funny people, Irish funny language. You might have seen the sort of thing, people making serious or not so serious attempts to pronounce Irish words, particularly names and place names. Inevitably, there's a subgenre of other people correcting them, not always correctly, and another subgenre of people getting offended to varying degrees, saying that this is belittling a language and a culture by mocking how Irish words don't conform to English spelling rules. A good deal of those on all sides didn't seem to have any connection with Ireland. But to all of them, I'd say there are probably things in the world more worthy of getting annoyed about, but, they're right. There is more than a hint of what Edward Said called Orientalism, essentially viewing other cultures as quaint or inferior or amusing or threatening, but never a valid thing in its own right. It only has an existence to be observed by the other, the Westerner. And it's worth noting that complaining about inconsistent spelling is not exactly a glass house that you should be throwing stones anywhere near if you're an English speaker. I'm sure that all this has something to do with Ireland's soft power in the world, but I'm not sure exactly what. Well, we know what the one thing that's worse than being talked about is. In a moment, we'll have that interview, but thanks, first of all, to all of the patrons who are still around. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, not like some major podcasters, but it pays for things like phone bills and web hosting. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And it's also a great morale booster. It lets us know that people out there are listening and appreciating the podcast. And we make an effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee or an all-expenses trip to the Maldives once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line now, I have Cormac Lucy. Cormac is a lecturer in finance at the Irish Management Institute and also at Trinity College Dublin. And he's an economics columnist with Sunday Times Ireland and a general talking head when people want to hear about economics and the economy in general. You obviously have a political and ideological outlook as well, Cormac. So it might be a bit strange, but I do want you to answer the question, and it's serious. Are you a Marxist?
No.
But you might be a little bit, and the reason I'm asking that is because your focus, and I've been looking through your blog and a lot of the articles that you've written, and your focus is very, very sharply on the impact of economics on society, and that is something, like in terms of materialism, that Marx would have been very much a believer in, even if he didn't believe the same prescriptions or things, recommendations that you would believe in. But I'm just wondering, have you been thinking recently that, in the last 5-10 years, there's been a huge shift away from the impact of economics on politics? And for want of a better word, the culture wars are beginning to have more of an impact. Would you agree with that analysis to begin with?
Well, I agree with that analysis, but just to come back to the Marxism, I'm a little bit like that Japanese soldier who came out of the jungle 40 years after World War II had formally ended in 1945, in the sense that I'll be 64 in a few weeks' time. I grew up in the 70s and 80s when the Cold War was very much still a war and still uncertain as to its eventual outcome. And I quickly came to the conclusion that what was being practiced on the far side of the Iron Curtain was a disaster from a human rights perspective, from an ordinary life perspective, from an economic perspective. So I'm actually quite ideologically anti-Marxist.
Yep.
I had a first cousin who was murdered by the North Koreans in the Korean War, first cousin of my grandfather, so first cousin twice removed from me, a Colombian missionary priest who had the misfortune to go out there in the 1930s. So he had suffered imprisonment under the Japanese occupation and then got to suffer execution thanks to the tender mercies of the communists. Coming to the question you just asked about cultural issues becoming more dominant in the economic debate than economic issues, I certainly think that's true, probably because cultural issues are easier to understand. Economic questions seem increasingly out of reach in the sense that any one individual's capacity to influence the economic practices and policies that we follow seem ever smaller, whereas you can always express an opinion about some current cultural row.
You may well be correct that it's easier to understand cultural issues than economic issues. I'm not sure that's always true. I think that the SPD in Germany and the Socialist Party in France have suffered huge setbacks, and probably they were the parties that were most starkly pursuing the economic interests of their voter base. And you gave your age. I wouldn't have asked, but you volunteered it. But do you think that maybe there's kind of a generation of not only economists, but economics-driven politicians who are essentially being shown that their politics is essentially going out of date?
No. Economics matters as much as it ever did. The fundamental problem facing socialists across Europe and in Ireland, when we look at Sinn Féin, is that their voter base is essentially national and socialist, but the leadership cadres are internationalist and socialist. And when immigration was a minor issue, that contradiction didn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's the biggest thing that matters. And we've seen very substantial drops we've seen a halving in opinion poll support for Sinn Féin over the last 2 years. The Social Democratic Party in Germany, I'm a huge fan and follower of German history. And if you follow, the biggest political event of the last century was Nazism and the catastrophe that it unleashed. And if you study the record of all of the German political parties in the run-up to Hitler's takeover, it really was the German Social Democratic Party. They had the most honourable, clearest-headed record of any party. So it's astonishing to see them reduced to their current politically powerless state, given their exemplary role in German politics and in the development of democracy after World War I and the rollout of social democracy. Whatever your misgivings, my misgivings about it might be, that they played a seminal role there, and now they're really struggling for political survival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Willy Brandt and so forth kind of pretty much built what was then the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. And I take your point on that. And the reason I asked the question was because I noticed on your blog a reference to the Clinton phrase of "it's the economy, stupid." And it may or may not be, and it may be the case that what is called identity politics is a submerged realignment based on economic realignments, or it may be that it's just another political dimension that is non-economic, that is driving voter bases. But what I'm kind of interested in is, and I should say belated congratulations and maybe commiserations on your vote in the local elections. I should say you stood as a candidate in Dunleary Rathdown County Council, and you missed out on a seat in a 6-seater, which had previously been a 7-seater. You missed out on the 6th seat by 2 votes, am I correct?
1 vote.
One
Wikipedia has it wrong, and in fact it was 0.2 of a vote.
0.2, yeah.
So it got down in the recount. It got got right down into the entrails. Anyway, I lost, so that's
I'm sure that was gutting, and you not only lost, but in probably the most heart-wrenching way. So my commiserations on that. You did not lose for the lack of celebrity endorsements. You had Michael McDowell prominently displayed on your election literature as a major endorser. But I guess the kind of question that I want to ask, and I've been going through your blog, and you are pretty clear on how you think the Irish state fails and the Irish, what might be called the permanent government, like the civil service, the way that the country is run. And you're pretty clear on your solution for that. And one of the lines you quote, not yours originally, but you're obviously quoting it approvingly, saying, Fine Gael has been too left for too long. Explain to me that background, what that means and what brings you to that opinion.
Well, it's not an original line. This was a line offered by the now sadly retiring Mayo TD Michael Ring, who I know well. I grew up in Castlebar, which was 11 miles in old currency from Westport, which is where Michael Ring is based. And I got involved in a few elections for Fine Gael down in Castlebar when I was a member of Fine Gael in college. I think just coming back to the question of the state, before we come to Fine Gael, of the state being weak at delivery. There's a very interesting lecture which was shown on the internet from London about state incapacity.
Yep.
And the 2 main guests were Dominic Cummings, who had been the key advisor to Boris Johnson's Conservative government.
Yeah. An architect of Brexit, it should be said.
Yeah, and Lord Adonis, who is a Labour peer. And they were both giving their perspectives on the increasing difficulty for any government to get anything done. And recently, Matt Ridley left the House of Lords because he'd reached the age where we've got to step back. And he was, in an article for The Spectator, he was bemoaning the blob that, he can vote for parliamentarians, but he can't vote for members of regulatory bodies or judges sitting on courts, even though these regulatory bodies and courts can play an extraordinarily influential role in whether things happen or don't happen. And we see this in Ireland most clearly with construction, where the length of time from a project, from the inception of a construction project to its completion and sale to the eventual owners can exceed 5 years. And we have a housing crisis. But, the last time I was in Leinster House visiting Michael McDougall, I was sitting opposite him at his desk, and just beside me at the desk, he had to take a call, so I was just fidgeting. And he had these two legislative slabs on his desk, and it was 2 copies of the recent planning bill, but now Planning Act, I presume, 712 pages in length. Now, whatever the solution to our housing crisis is, it is not 712 pages of legislation. So I think one of the problems afflicting politics across Western Europe is that we have done a whole load of small things which individually can be justified, but which, when you add them up, things like a wildlife directive, where you've suddenly got, if you're building something, you've got to make sure you're not obliterating some species of butterfly. All of these things are individually justifiable, but when you add them all up in aggregate, they give you the result that the state's capacity to act is extraordinarily constrained.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that can happen. That can happen sometimes. And you mentioned one particular bill of 712 pages long. You had previously mentioned Dominic Cummings, one of the architects of Brexit, and it is notable that one of the refrains of that campaign was getting rid of Brussels bureaucracy and cutting through red tape and so forth. Brexit has been singularly catastrophically bad at that. 712 pages of legislation, that's a lot. But the reality is that modern life and the modern economy and government and so forth is very, very complex, and you can't just instruct it to not be complex. And people who have tried to do that have had, at best, no result, but often really catastrophic results. Isn't that the case?
To give you a German word answer, Jein.
A mixture of yes and no, yeah?
Yeah, a mixture of yeah and nein. If we're going to solve the housing problem in Ireland, a group of people at the top of government are going to have to bulldoze their way through a lot of these barriers. Now, I'm not suggesting that they do that illegally. They'll have to change laws to do that. But I am suggesting that they should be extremely intolerant of the existing setup, which is delivering a social catastrophe.
Yeah.
And another point made by now Cummings in this lecture that I was watching was far less persuasive, far more ready to go to reach for a smart-sounding, glib solution than Lord Adonis of Labour. But another issue that they both agreed upon was a second problem facing government is that effectively we have incestuous inbreeding in government administration. So if you look at the identities and career track records of our top civil servants, they're inbred. They've essentially been in the same department or in a neighbouring, an adjacent department all their career. There's very little cross-fertilisation at the tops of our government departments from outside the civil service, outside the state bureaucracy. There's very little coming and going of expertise. I think that's another problem. I think we've got a lot of mediocre people at the top of government.
Yep.
My mother always said, don't be personal, but I'm afraid my baser instincts always push me in that direction. So if we look at Paschal Donohoe,
Yep.
on paper, he should be masterful as minister. If we look at Stephen Donnelly, so Paschal Donohoe, ex-Procter & Gamble, top academic results in Trinity, so he's coming in from the private sector, he's got managerial experience in a major company. If we look at the Minister for Health, Stephen Donnelly, a former McKinsey consultant, so the leading management consultancy company on the planet. If we look at his Secretary General, Robert Watt, who was previously Secretary General in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform.
Yeah.
So on the face of it, those three guys really ought to be able to move and change things. Take the steering wheel of government and drive government in a sensible direction. And yet, our health expenditure is out of control.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And it is notable, perhaps to echo your point a little bit before I challenge it, our health expenditure per capita is on a par, either equal to or very close to places like Sweden. However, that's before you adjust for the population profile. Countries, for example, like Sweden have a far higher age profile. We have a much younger age profile. Yeah. And if you were to stratify that spending per age cohort, then I think you would find that we are, if you were to adjust it for the fact that we have a much younger and therefore expected to be much healthier population, I think you'd find we are spending far more than the equivalent in the Nordic countries. But I want to challenge you on one thing in particular. First of all of those people who you mentioned, Paschal Donohoe and Stephen Donnelly in particular in the cabinet and some top civil servants, you're right, they came out of those top consultancy firms. They didn't stay there. And unlike, I guess, the majority of the people in those consultancy firms, so you might ask, why did they leave? And what was it that made them leave? Perhaps it was that they didn't fit into that culture or were not up to scratch. I don't think I've really thought about that, so I'm not going to make a firm statement on that. But I think the real gap, and I'm going to say you're wrong, but I think there's a gap in your argument there, is that you are assuming that everything that you and I would identify as problems, and we probably agree on that, you're assuming that that's a result of failure. And I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that those policy failures, as you and I think most people in the country would see them, they're not viewed as failures by everybody. And if we were to mention the housing policy, which is, at catastrophic levels in Ireland, that does suit some people. That policy makes a very small number of property speculators incredibly wealthy. That suits developers, and at a much, much, much lower level, it suits a demographic cohort of voters who are perhaps closer to, your demographic than to the people who are looking for their first home. It suits them quite well because it keeps up the price of their asset. Now, that's at a much lower level than the people who are making hundreds of millions and I think sometimes billions out of property speculation. And one other example that occurs to me was and what you can only call the catastrophe that was in the ODC, the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement. Now, that was the people who should have been going in and arresting, for example, the people running Anglo-Irish Bank and other institutions. But that organisation was very deliberately and very intentionally starved of funds and starved of resources in the years leading up to the economic crash in a way that makes it very, very difficult to think that failure of enforcement, that failure of law enforcement was actually an accident that nobody could have seen coming and that nobody intended. That's the case, isn't it?
No.
You don't agree?
Look, we can always rationalise failure as being the consequence of dark figures in the background rubbing their hands in glee at this outcome. But if we look at health, there are multiple people who are benefiting from the current status quo, particularly insiders working in the health service.
Yeah.
But it is not rational, in my opinion, for us to have what is in effect not a health service, it's a sickness service. It's a service that focuses on treating sickness rather than a service that focuses on promoting health.
You know, Cormac, if they even did that well, I'd be happy. But even that is not done well.
And that brings, I'm very unhappy with the quality of the people at the top. I think I don't think it benefits anybody to have crime on our main city streets effectively out of control. I don't see who benefits from that. So I think a lot of this is just we're people drifting along in politics, accepting the status quo and not feeling any great impulse to change it. People drifting along in administration, be it in the Department of Justice or on Garda Síochána or in our court service. Like it's very difficult to motivate the police to enforce the law if when they go to the bother of enforcing the law and bring somebody before the courts, they then get some pathetic sentence or a suspended sentence.
Yeah, but we've moved off the Guardian. The Guardian and crime and so forth is perhaps a slightly more knotty subject and it's more difficult to pick out the individual effects. But either with health or with housing, what is perceived by the vast bulk of the population is in fact quite beneficial to a certain cohort of very powerful people. And they are people who are blocking change and they are benefiting from blocking change. It doesn't take an awful lot to put two and two together there, does it?
But there'll always be beneficiaries of bad policy.
Yeah.
So that doesn't excuse, there have been arms manufacturers and leading generals who would have been perfectly happy in the latter years of Hitler's disastrous regime in Germany.
Yeah.
But it was still a disaster.
Yeah.
And therefore, those who tried to change it were entirely justified. What strikes me is just the lack of reform momentum within our current government and the lack of reform momentum across Parliament.
I agree. I agree. But deal with specifically with for example, it wasn't a lack of momentum. It was a very active and very rigorously pursued policy to effectively cripple the ODC, the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement, which effectively made it impossible to investigate corporate corruption in the years leading up to the crash.
There were prosecutions from the crash was not caused by corporate corruption. Let's get that off the table.
It certainly wasn't helped.
Just because people suffer enormously doesn't mean that there was somebody bad behind it.
No, Cormac, to go from first principles, is it agreed that the ODC was starved of funding?
Every public institution argues that it's starved of.
No. This has been forensically done. That, and in fact, it is not true that in the run up to say from the turn of the century up to 2008.
William,
go ahead.
It is not a question that can be forensically examined. You can examine a scientific matter where a fact is a fact. We're talking here in the realm of opinion.
Yeah, but when money was being thrown around, but like snuff at a wake for pretty much every government in pretty much every government department, the ODC got none of it.
I don't have the facts here in front of me.
Okay.
I wager you €100 that the ODCE got increased funding every year from 2000 to 2007.
I would wager that it's not proportional to many other less deserving causes, but I don't have those precise figures in front of me, so I don't want to bog us down in that.
The less deserving causes may be the more immediate political causes, particularly health. And that is a challenge in government, regardless of who's in government. But the real reason for the crash was that we had interest rates that were too low, credit that was too cheap. That spawned a bubble. If you had been a wise and cautious banker, supposing you'd been head of Bank of Ireland, they were generally the more cautious of the banks, for over a decade, you looked like an idiot. You were counselling caution, and your market share was declining, your profits were declining, your key staff were leaving. you look like a moron. And this was the structural corrosion that the low interest rates that we got when we joined the euro inflicted on the economy, and that made good governance extraordinarily difficult. So it is said that when Michael Buckley, who had been the chief executive of AIB and previously Secretary General in the Department of Social Welfare, he was an example of somebody who jumped the fence. But that when he was leaving his position as CEO of AIB, I think in 2005, it said, now maybe this isn't true, that at the departure dinner, he said he wanted AIB to look more like Anglo-Irish Bank. And sadly, he got his way, not in the way that he would have thought, but it was a bubble. And that's not amenable. No doubt there were wrongdoings taking place within that bubble, but that was the central problem, not mismanagement or criminality on the part of individual managers.
Yeah, I think that criminality, broadly defined, was not entirely absent. I'm not saying it would be the only issue, but I think if you listen to some of the tapes on the way which Anglo-Irish executives spoke about, for example, the head of the central bank, Mr. Neary, they clearly held the idea that the central bank was a regulator in complete contempt, and they had.
I hold it in contempt,
perhaps from a different point of view.
The only people who have ever threatened to sue me in my career have been the central bank. They had a department pre-crash called the Financial Stability Department. It produced an annual financial stability report. Those reports were consistently complacent.
Yeah.
Now,
I think you're being generous.
In May 2005, 2 years before the bubble peaked, I wrote in McGill magazine, "Where is all this leading? Simple. We can't keep increasing our borrowings forever. The constraint on our indebtedness will not be interest rates, as in previous decades, it will be in our debt capacity. The good news is that we may still have some distance to go before we hit our debt limit, so enjoy the party while it lasts, but don't be taken in by it, and be wary of those economists who fail to predict this bubble, who don't explain it, and who certainly won't dare to predict its end." So I was one of, there were people like David McWilliams, people like Morgan Kelly. There were a number of Richard Curran.
Yeah, there were people who were sounding alarm bells.
Issuing clear warnings. And the equivalent warning today that nobody is listening to, because to pay attention to this warning, it's too awful in terms of its consequences. It's like Hugh Edwards's family hearing that he was accessing porn, child porn. He's pleaded guilty this morning. The equivalent crisis today is that our whole government spending apparatus is built on the foundation of tax receipts from the multinational sector that account. So over 60%, by my reckoning, of our total tax take across all headings is coming from the multinational sector.
Would that include income tax on their employees?
Across all headings.
Okay.
Across all headings. All of them aggregated. And in America, they're turning against letting this sort of revenue slip through their fingers, particularly Trump, but also the Democrats. So we're building a public spending bubble on a financially fragile set of foundations. And this is one aspect of Paschal Donohoe I find very hard to take, that he's there posturing as a priest of prudence. But the reality is the spending growth we have is anything but prudent. Read the details reports of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, and in their bureaucratic characteristic understatement, they're quite coruscating in their criticism of our current budgetary settings.
And I don't disagree with much of what you're saying, and I think you are correct, particularly in the reliance and over-reliance on the multinational sector. It's not entirely clear to me what we would do instead. You could just put it away and put it down.
Spend less on welfare.
Yeah.
Spend less on health.
Okay.
Change the incentives facing individuals working in our public administration so that exceptionally strong performance is rewarded and exceptionally poor performance is punished. There are a couple of very simple things you could start with.
I'm not sure they're simple.
Everybody's tiptoeing around, not willing to give offence to anybody else. Those things would be offensive to certain groups. But the notion that we keep pouring money into a grotesquely inefficient sickness system, it's just head-wrecking.
Mm-hmm. What you're describing sounds to me a little bit like what David Cameron did when he became Prime Minister in the UK in the austerity programme. I'm not sure that had a great outcome. I think Britain is in a downward economic spiral that would seem to be very difficult to get out of. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's certainly very, very challenging. And that
meritocracy is not austerity. Rewarding strong performance and punishing bad performance, that is, one would expect that to boost system productivity.
What happened in Britain, which was under austerity, most certainly didn't do that. And one of the issues was that the people in positions of power were able to insulate themselves against that austerity in a way that people who were not powerful were not. And the cost of those cuts fell enormously disproportionately on people who were on the bottom rung of the ladder. But the issue that I want to look at specifically is, and I've read a lot of things that you've written, and I think a lot of it is very intelligent, but it seems to me that if you take the kind of body of work that you've done, you seem to be way more enthusiastic on policies that disproportionately affect people at the bottom of the ladder. And, for example, you mentioned the Planning Act and the restrictions that it imposes. But one of the problems in Ireland is that we have a relatively small number of fabulously wealthy people who are able to constrict the supply of building land and keep up its value by doing that. And the result of that is that we have a pathetically small number of houses being built. And it is just observably not true that planning constriction is the problem there, because we have a huge number of outstanding planning permissions that are not being built. Can you understand that even if people who agree with a lot of the things you say, the focus always seems to be on what people at the bottom of the ladder need to give up?
The biggest land banks in Ireland, in those areas where one would want to build, say County Dublin, the counties around Dublin, Cork, the biggest land banks are held by public sector entities.
I'm not sure that's true. They may be big, but I have looked at this and
check it out.
I have. And when you're talking about zoned serviced land, I don't think that's true. You could argue certainly that some of those public sector land banks could be rezoned and serviced relatively easy. But if you're looking at zoned serviced land, that's around Dublin, held by less than a dozen people, the great bulk of it.
I'm just Googling now in response to questioning that. And here's a report from last September. Controller and Auditor General, still no plans for half of the housing agency's land. NAMA did a spatial analysis of residential land banks. I don't know what, I can't get the answer to that quickly. So I understand there was an audit done in County Dublin in the last 6 months, and that 8 or 9 out of the top 10 land banks were public sector entities. So I think you need, and there's another issue which we haven't got around to that is lacking, and that is, like I'm reading a book about the history of the Irish Republican Brotherhood at the minute, an excellent book written by John O'Byrne Ranelagh. And one of Michael Collins's great virtues was that he got his hands dirty and made things happen. One of the points Lord Adonis made in this lecture about state incapacity in Britain was, if you're a minister and let's say you were a university lecturer or you were chief executive of a development agency or something, you may lack real nitty-gritty hands-on management experience. And Adonis's point was ministers need to get their hands dirty and check, do the follow-up work, make sure that's happening themselves. Go out and visit places. So he spent a day a week, Adonis did, going out visiting parts of his ministerial empire. And most of the places he went to, he was the first minister they'd seen in a generation. When I worked with Michael McDougall, I was an advisor to him in the Department of Justice. He chaired the weekly management meetings and would work his way through the agenda every week, checking, A, what have we done? B, what are we proposing to do? And then go at it again a week later. So I think this is another issue that we're getting younger and younger heads of government whose minds have been polluted by things like watching The West Wing, and they think it's all about sloganeering and messaging, whereas those things are important, but even more important is delivery, and delivery means dogged, persistent follow-up, and I think that's lacking as well.
Okay, but in that case, and I actually agree with you, I think you're correct on that to a very large extent. But, for example, since we've mentioned housing multiple times, the housing minister, Darragh O'Brien, was explicitly warned that pumping more cash into the housing market, so you have an increased amount of money chasing a fixed amount of houses being built, that the only effect of that would be to enrich the developers and the people selling the land to them. Yet, time after time, we've had first-time buyer grants and so forth renewed, and a whole load of advantages and tax credits and so forth that have no effect at all other than inflating the price of housing. It's basically just moving taxpayers' money directly into the pockets of very wealthy people. But the other issue that has been on the desk of this government was of the derelict and vacant buildings levy. That was previously set at 3% before the current government. That was then planned to be increased to 7%, and Fianna Fáil in their manifesto said that it would be increased to 14%. And what did the government do? They scrapped it on the promise that in the final year of the government, in the budget of the final year of the government, they might have a different, more effective levy implemented. Now, anybody who at the start of a government is making plans for what happens in the last year of the government is obviously making sure that it's never going to happen. There was an awful lot more effectiveness and follow-through displayed in making sure that all of those tax breaks, which benefit builders and developers and land speculators, nobody was behind the door making sure that they happened. But when it comes to a levy on vacant properties, and we have a huge amount of vacant and derelict properties lying empty while people are homeless, there is a bit of a contrast between those two, isn't there?
You're quite preoccupied by the danger of anybody making money.
No, not at all. No, I've no bother with that at all.
No, they seem to be the persistent boogeyman.
Not at all.
Lurking
not at all.
behind your questions.
I'd be more than happy for people to make money if they were providing something of use to society. You have me read wrongly, I think.
I was running, as you mentioned, in the local elections, and I was struck by Fianna Fáil campaign literature that on housing, and I was flabbergasted by it because they might have 2 pages of there might be a 4-page A4 glossy leaflet, and the 2 centre pages would feature 6 or 7 different initiatives they've taken on housing.
Mm-hmm.
And each of these initiatives, in its own terms, sounded great. But when you add it all up, the result is pathetic.
Mm-hmm.
For
example?
Well, the level of housing construction is falling far short of what we need.
Yeah, about a third of what we need.
What we need is off the charts.
Yeah.
Our level of construction per million people is well ahead of nearly every other European country.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still only running at maybe 30 or 40% of what we need. So the big issue is the growth in the population. That's causing this problem, coupled with our incapacity to address, to house the people coming in. So if it were me as minister, And like all these people warning me that things are going to go wrong. If you're a minister, you're going to get an infinity of those warnings.
Yeah.
You've really just got to simply say, I'm here to get things done. I'm not going to get things done in a perfect way. Mistakes are going to be made. If I were appointed dictator of housing in the morning, I would be incentivizing house construction. And I have no doubt that I would be making people millionaires who didn't deserve to be millionaires.
Yeah, I've no problem with it. I don't know about the deserve, but I've no problem with that. But my issue is that in Ireland, in very many years that I have been an adult, in probably most of the years that I have been an adult, it is much more profitable to sit on a development land and allow its price to go up than it is to develop.
That was not true between 2007 and 2014. Thousands of guys went bust because that reversed. So that that's not an axiom.
Yeah, but very, very often. Phenomenon. Yes, and part of the problem is that it is a cyclical phenomenon. But
who foresaw in 2012 that if you look at the data, Ireland's population has grown by 40%.
Yeah.
In the 25 years to 2022. The next fastest growing EU state with a population in excess of 1 million is Spain, just under half that. So I don't think anybody foresaw coming out of the crash. Remember, in 2011, 2012, we were talking about bulldozing ghost estates in what was then fancifully called the Upper Shannon Basin. I think it's reverted to being County Leitrim in the meantime. So things change and nothing is guaranteed. And the notion that there are these bad people who have bought lots of land and they're just sitting there waiting for it to inevitably grow in value. If the multinational bubble bursts, and there is a not insignificant risk that it will, a lot of the circumstances a lot of the basic preconditions that are causing this housing problem may melt. I hope that doesn't happen. We need to resolve the housing crisis on the basis that it's going to remain there unless we increase supply. But that's a not insignificant risk. So I think one of the great dangers we have is that an inordinate amount of our social discourse, its primary focus is not to assist understanding of problems. It's to make participants in the discussion look smart.
Yes.
And for them to make the knowing comment, oh, well, that was clear at the time. Most of the time it wasn't. And if it was, why didn't you make a pile of money off it?
Yeah, it is not always available to the people who say to make a pile of money off it, but that didn't necessarily detract from your comment. But the reality is that, for example, huge swathes of inner city Dublin, like Dublin 8, Dublin 3 in particular, are derelict and have been so for decades because it is profitable in capital terms to hold on to vacant sites and do nothing with them. And that the holders of those, taking into account what you say about the public sector having land banks, but the private sector holders of those land banks, if they were to put all of that land on the housing market in one go, or even a chunk of it on the market in one go, they would devalue the remainder of their stock by a huge amount, and it is not rational for them to do so. And we have a tax system that effectively allows people to profit enormously from dereliction.
I think we have people running our housing department who aren't very capable. If I were the minister, I'd be saying, here's a 20% derelict levy, and next year it's 40%.
I totally agree.
Get on with it. The sheriff has arrived, and if you don't get off the street, you get a bullet.
Cormac, I'm agreeing with you 100%. No, Cormac, pause on that. Cormac, pause on that. Agreeing with you 100%. I would do exactly the same thing. But contrast the vigour and the enthusiasm and the effectiveness of that housing department when it is promoting first-time buyer grants, which, as you as an economist know, is simply transferring money from the taxpayer to developers and land speculators. That's all it does. It has no other effect. Compare the vigour that they do that with the vigour of the dereliction tax that was effectively abolished and promised to do something on it a few years later in the last year of the government, which everybody knows anything you schedule for the last year of the government never happens.
Well, yes, those first-time buyer grants, they sound great, but their net economic effect is pretty redundant.
Yeah, and they're very
expensive. Except to boost property values and boost, therefore, the wealth of property owners. And property owners are a very considerable voter bloc. And that is the downside of confronting our housing crisis. It's that you're going to reduce the wealth of a lot of people who own property. And that's maybe 50% of the adult voters.
Yeah.
If it was me, I'd be, Donald Trump has promised to build a wall. I would promise to build a wall from Dunleary to Howth and reclaim the land inside.
But we have huge amounts of land. We're the Western European country with, by a mile, the lowest population density and, shockingly, also the highest land prices, which is very anomalous given the supply and demand on that. We have gotten very, I guess because it's of interest to both of us, very derailed into the property and housing issue. It's very important to an awful lot of people. But just in general terms, I have a rake of notes here, but in general terms, would you accept that there is a danger that commentators like you are perhaps at risk of being strident and saying you want to build walls from Dunleary to Howth and take strident action when it suits a certain economic class, and when it doesn't, you're not quite so forthright?
Look, we're paid to be strident. Your column isn't going to be read if it's anodyne and carefully weighed up and utterly balanced. I don't get lent upon at all in terms of the line I take on issues. So,
although you wouldn't be taking that line at all if you hadn't been selected by the newspaper that employs you or that pays you, and that could be where the filtering is.
Well, I would have been writing very critically of the Irish banks in 05, 06, 07. That was not in the establishment's interests. I would be very, very critical of our senior civil service cadre at the top of our government departments. I think they're vastly overrated and need a significant reshuffle. That's not in the interests of our power structures. Reclaiming Dublin Bay and like the Dutch putting properties there, that would be in the greater interest of those looking to get onto the housing ladder who need an affordable entry point than it would be of people who own property. So I don't know what line you think I've taken that is towing some imaginary establishment line, when I would generally see myself as being a very critical establishment insider. I'm pro-establishment. I want Ireland to work, but I'm extremely pissed off at the lack of efficiency and competence with which our establishment functions, and I wanted to do a lot better.
Cormac Lucy, lecturer in finance at the IMI and also at Trinity, economics columnist with the Sunday Times Ireland, and within a whisker of being a councillor on Dunleary, Rathdown County Council. Commiserations on that one, but thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Cormac Lucy at Cormac Lucy. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. That covers the cost of the phone bills and the web hosting and all those little things that add up. So if you could throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month like the other patrons, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email, All of that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.